So to say this is the Wednesday, July 5th Mobio work group, and we're talking about Robot and how it's a tool to massage ontologies and extract information out of them and get information into them. And this is all towards, well, actually, first, Brian, why don't you explain a little bit about what your objectives are in using the tool? That would help.
Okay, so I think our objectives for Mobio are so that the different groups who are going to be working on Mobio can work somewhat independently on their ontology branches, but then we can do essentially a merge to deal with any conflicts, but also have the ontology, I guess, generate itself using the um, using the terms that we've already defined and then just adding in the new terms. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes. So that's right. We can, one objective of using Robot is to have tabular views of ontology branches that people can work on in Google Sheets or some shared spreadsheet app, and then take those and compile them into ontology import files. So I'll bring up Mobio right now. Um, the Mobio file right now does not have any import files. Um, in the class hierarchy, I remember there were a few folks specializing in some of the branches. So I would have to dig, somebody would have to guide me to show which branches might be probably under entity, right? Which branches need attention here.
I don't often look at it in this view. So I know that Nicole's group was working on that I can't remember what they're called now, but that the ICEs, right? So those are types of transposases. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe under there.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure. Daniel or Aishwara, do you have a better idea of like something you've added more recently that Damien could look at?
I am yet to get it into this, so I've not used it before at all. I've been told that there's something on tyrosine stuff, and I see.
Tyrosine recombinases, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking as well.
Okay. Well, suffice to say, what we can do is take branches of each of these things and devote separate tables to them and give access to people through, say, Google Sheets to work on them. And Robot doesn't matter if you're using that tool. It doesn't matter whether the entities you're working on are really unique and only have some kinds of annotations and relations, and or whether you're just splitting branches of one kind of thing into two tables just to provide different groups with access. Either way, you can create import files out of that, and the import files show up under this active ontology direct imports tab. So what I'm going to do, I won't actually talk anymore about Mobio. I'm going to teach by analogy, and we'll just work on Foodon.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be best because obviously Mobio is still fairly skeletal at this point. So I think looking at like an established system would be helpful.
So, for example, what Foodon has right now is this robot wine import file, and you can look at it on its own. And first step will be to look at it in its a look at it in its Google Sheets view. So just to explain the basics of what we're getting into with Robot. Here's a Google Sheet that's providing all the information we need in Foodon for these kinds of wines. And there's a whole bunch of columns, and each column basically gets transformed into an ontology, either axiom or annotation that shows up in a wine listing. So the way Robot works is it pays special attention to the second row in the spreadsheet, and in there it takes its commands for converting the content of that row into some annotation or axiom or other relation. So one wanted to go to Foodon to take a look to see what an entry was. Here's red wine. And it's got a parent class grape wine. It's got this definition and some other annotations and comments. And it's got a logical axiom derives from some red grape bowl. So,
Damien, is it okay if I interrupt and just ask questions as we go?
yeah, sure.
Okay. So when you make, like, if red wine wasn't a term that existed and you wanted to make it, do you, when you make that ontology ID that says like Foodon 033, yada, yada, how do you know what one you're going to use?
Right. So you have to do one of two things. You're either going into Protege and just creating a real minimal entry. So let me pretend I'm adding a new, first I'll look up red wine here. So here's the red wine branch. Basically under this whole grape wine branch. Yeah, so I'll circle around to the answer to your question.
That's okay.
Let me just explain the lay of the land here. So over there in the active ontology, I highlighted the robot wine import. That's the result of robot being applied to this tabular information and generating an OWL file, an input file. And the result of that is this entire branch of grape wine and all underlying classes in it. So each of the entries here, the entities here, has a Foodon ID, and you will find that in this robot table. And the grape wine entry here is sort of the top level, although there are some other entries that the table is also generating, but you will find every entry in the ontology that you find here in this table. Okay, so if I was to try to create a new type of grape wine, I could add a subclass and call it temp ID.
Sure.
I have to make sure, because when you edit Protege, Protege will use whatever ID scheme that you were just using as you last opened an ontology. And that means if you open an ontology with a different number scheme, it may actually switch that on you. So this is just a cautionary note.
Okay.
That you actually have to make sure that all the settings are current for you. So there's me changing digit count to 8, just because I've noticed that there wasn't a leading 0. So anyway, Mobio will have a similar kind of thing going on. You'll need Mobio and then exactly the right number of digits specified.
Yep.
Okay, so this is giving me a new entity, and I could actually go and copy that IRI, that ID, and enter it into a new term here. And robot just needs the already kind of it knows the namespace for Mobi, say, but you would have to make sure that you provide that in the format it's expecting, which is a prefix and then an ID with a colon. Okay.
Yep, that makes sense.
Okay. So that's the first way. And that's sort of the more surefire way, as long as everyone is syncing and they're not creating IDs at the same time. But the other way that people have organized creating new terms, and this might work better if everyone's plunking away in the same hour doing stuff, is to create a table or a tab on the same spreadsheet of all the Mobio content that just lists off all the available IDs. And you, as a user, claim the new ID at the end of the sheet for your purpose. So this is being a little sluggish. But anyway, down, this is like, Mobi has every ID in its ontology here.
Right.
And then here's where we add more. And this is a surefire way of not scrambling, not having people intersect. So what we could do is have a Mobio spreadsheet when the first tab of it is reserved, and you keep track of all the new IDs.
Right. So could it be the case that, for example, like the 1-2 up from where you are, target of material processing, so it's reserved by, it's been reserved by Sebastian, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like in the ontology yet, right? Like
Right.
in the official released version.
Right.
But he has said like, don't use this ID because I'm going to use it.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to make this term, or it's going to be released or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that way, okay, so basically, yeah, it's just tracking before a release, like so that you don't have conflicts, so that somebody else doesn't come along and say, like, I'm gonna use 0003601.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Pretty surefire.
Because if you're looking at, like, if I'm just imagining, like, if Will's group and Nicole's group were both looking at a protege version of Mobio that was based on the most recent release, that could be a thing that comes up, is that if you're just generating it based on the next available accession, they would actually both be independently using the same accessions, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Okay.
So we
Makes sense.
yeah, we probably want to, given that Mobio might be growing incrementally quite a bit to start, this probably is a great way to coordinate and see activity and new items.
Oh, I see. Aishwarya has a question. You can go ahead.
Yeah, I have a really basic question. So the ontology IDs, do we set them through Prodigy, or does Robot have a function as well where we can specify specific ontology IDs to like each group?
Right. So that I was going to mention the third way to do all of this, but I think this is probably the best way. This one we're looking at now. But Protege does have a third way, which is that as you as a user who logs in can be given a range of IDs, and Protege will by default create them in your range. Now, this has to be set up in Protege through a table.
The contributor?
Yeah, let's see. So it's an ODK thing that they mention, Mobio ID ranges. So if you open this up, it gives you, if you are a user and you have an ID that Protege recognizes when you log in, I think by ORCID or something. I don't actually even know how that works. It will automatically start your next available term ID to something within that range. And I've seen that activate for me when I go into some of the other ontologies. That's a way of giving you individually access to a range that nobody else will trump over.
Right.
When you create terms willy-nilly.
So for example, like I would have a batch of numbers that all start with 4, and Aishwarya would have a batch of numbers that all start with 5, and
Yeah.
that way we never overlap.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one could think of doing that if you don't want to coordinate exactly which terms you're adding. Say somebody though, but it's relatively easy. If somebody wants to add 100 new terms, then just reserve 100 new items, and it doesn't matter if they're not entered into the ontology yet.
Right. Yeah, it
So-
doesn't even necessarily matter if you have the label info figured out, because you could just say like, I know I'm going to be adding a bunch of terms, so you just reserve the ID and worry about the labels after, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Daniel, you have a question?
So I was wondering if I reserve an accession number and then I don't use it again and someone else continues, what happens? So does it automatically rearranges itself in a numerical order, or that then becomes something that nobody can use again?
Right. So from a technical perspective, first to say, this is just a table that human beings are reading to know what to do or not to do about their IDs. But one over on the ontology side, if somebody makes a mistake, say, and adds a duplicate ID, you will suddenly get 2 terms with their different labels and definitions overlapping. So there's nothing barring 2 import files having one ID accidentally and overlaying stuff onto one term as a result of that accident. So, what I'm getting at is that it's up to you, or if you move on, put somebody else's name in, or just mention an institution or a group name here. There's nothing technical that's happening about this term reservation. The actual work in using this ID is over on another tab. It's actually over here. This is the tab that's actually causing new and information to be added to the ontology import file. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So and I forget whether we have a Google Sheet set up yet. Ashura, do we have one, right? For Mobio? At least for your work?
So yeah, so I do have like a basic setup. I can share. I think I shared this with William, the previous person from Nicole's lab, like a basic setup that we have, but I haven't imported the terms. So I was using the previous curation template that Emma had shared in 2020. And I think recently Rhiannon, during one of our meetings, Rhiannon shared like the robo template that we use for Fodon. So I shared that with William. I can share it again on Mobio or with Brian Amos and Daniels separately, but I haven't populated the sheet as of now. I'm still working on it. It's a work in progress, but yeah, it is very similar to the Fodon of the Wine OFN sheet that Damien was showing. So I'm populating it with the old terms that I have changed a little bit, but I can definitely share the headers so everybody can get started on it.
Okay. So so here's a situation where we could share whichever one you think is most appropriate and call it the group spreadsheet. If you can pass a link to it now, I'll just take a peek at it. And, you put it in the meeting chat. We can just start working with that, and then Ashura, you can just reserve one tab of that for where you put your work. And then we can start looking at making new tabs for other groups to put their work.
Yeah, that would be
And
great.
the first tab
Sure.
we'll just have for this
Sure.
reserved ID span it doesn't preclude you operating within an ID range and adding terms that way, but for simplicity's sake, we could just start with this reserved concept. Just to show group activity. Okay, so setting that aside and moving on, I'll close this down and back to grapes and wines. So once you've put in an ID, all of the other columns will be adding information relative to that ID. Robot isn't any more intelligent than that. It has some tiny little ability to do substitution of terms, but I'm not going to get into that today. So, all right. So, what the process is for converting from this food on wine table into something that Robot can work with is to cut and paste all of these entries, every single row and column, into a text file. And first I'm going to open the existing one. So I have this little folder inside the food on source ontology imports hierarchy. So Mobio has the same thing, Mobio source ontology imports. And we created a separate little robot file folder. And one of the files is this wine TSV. So it's the tabular form version of this. That's robots operating off of. Every single little piece is there, the 2 rows, field label, and then the codes, and then the actual entries. So I can literally cut and paste what I just pasted from the Google Sheet into this and save it. And there's just, in this case, a 1-line change that I made. But
Right. And Robo can just parse it like that.
Say again?
Robot can just parse it like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, sorry, Damien. What are these like 4 terms that you have up here at the top before the black line? The protected geographical status and oh, sorry, there's way more than that. But like you have a black line further down.
Yeah.
So what is the top and the bottom?
Yeah. So there's a pattern that's going on about the wines here. We name off all the wines, and then some other categories, wine by region, and even some other classes here. But then we move on into the berries, the grape plants that back up each one. But the thing about all these terms is that they all have a label, a definition source, a parent, some synonyms that are active, and then the metadata about the editor who's adding it.
Sure.
Yeah. So in fact, we can lump all of these grape wine things together, and this is just a section of terms. So there's actually some other stuff here. It's not strictly a wine. It's a different category. It's utilizing this class here. So so what you're seeing here is that although I had to mention an ontology ID specifically here, I'm actually referencing classes by name here. That fills in the label, but I'm also referencing classes not by ID, but by name here. And even in here, like in the logical axiom, I'm actually not having to use IDs, but I get to use their English name.
Right.
So that's because Robot can actually look up the names of existing terms in an ontology that you give it. So we can use that to combine not only this table of info but also the main Mobio file. We'll give Robot a link to that so that it can look up Grapevine and know what its ID is and actually do an entry in the table to say, show that the parent of this red wine term is the Grapevine, whatever its ID is.
Right.
Uh,
Okay. And so this is also part of the puzzle with like the Mobio edit file, right? The robot edit file that specifies like the higher level terms that don't change.
yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So not only can Robot use any name that you create here and start referencing it in its other terms, but it can also reference any name that's within the Mobio hierarchy in general.
Very cool. I just have one more question for now. All the stuff at the top that's like SC percent split equals, that's
Right.
just robot parsing info, right?
Yeah.
So would it always look the same? Like will that row look exactly the same on our Mobio sheet?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
And the only variation is you might have some other little axioms that you want to add that are specific to some branches that would have their own columns. And
Okay.
you probably skip the Italian synonym stuff.
Yeah, sure.
So you can take out as many columns as you want and you can add new ones. And I'll talk a bit about what all this. Yeah.
And I'm assuming, Damien, the definition, it has IAO. So instead of that, we'll be having Mobio, or like this will stay the same.
Right. So ODK already
Mhm.
loads a number of IAO terms. This IAO quadruple O 115, this is IAO definition that we see in Mobio when we open it up. So let's see. Over here, not Foodon, but Mobio. Oh, didn't open Mobio yet. Okay, let me open Mobio.
I thought you did, but maybe it just got close.
Right. Yeah, so you'll see reference to, in the second row, to RDFS label, definition source. Oboe and owl has exact synonym. You get to reference whatever ontology annotations are or object properties that are listed here on your Mobio Protege annotation properties tab or object properties or data properties tab. So I'm going to just add data properties tab. So Mobio doesn't have any data properties, but so you could add some here. But in terms of annotation, you get to reference in that second robot line any annotation that shows up here. Now, we don't have the names spelled out at the moment, but we could add them here for greater legibility. And I think, yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So over in the command line level, Foodon. Here's the main Foodon directory, and here's imports. Imports. I'm remembering that ODK might have a different route where it wants its robot file templates, but anyway, there's robot. And the job of this little script setup that I have is that when I run a script on the robot folder, when I run a robot script on any one of these tabular files, it generates in the imports file, it generates a robot file by the same name or similar name. So wine.tsv gets converted into robot_wine. And where Mobio might differ a little bit at the moment from Foodon is that I'm using this OFN owl functional notation rather than the .owl suffix, which usually means RD an owl form in RDF XML. regardless of which way you're programming robot to do the syntax of the import, it will generate a file that you can import into OWL and have as part of your ontology. So here's wine.tsv. Just as we were seeing it in that text editor. And I have, and this is probably helpful for us for now, although I think ODK even has a way of automatically generating robot. We can set it up that way, but this README file contains a list of the canned commands that will be used to generate the import file. So this is the wine.tsv processing command for robot. And it's got 3 lines to it. The template itself is the input data. And then we're adding this other input, and I think you can have a couple of inputs. What they're doing is they're using those to look up information, the labels of terms. So this will be the Mobio merged file, which contains all of the imports plus the main Mobio edit file together. So we've got access to all the names we want.
Yep.
Then this is the output file, which is it needs an IRI, something to resolve on the web. And then the actual file itself, output. So the robot one. Okay. So I have some other imports. They all have similar setups. So there we go. Robot wine. And I'm going to demonstrate what happens when an error occurs in this as well. So far, this is looking like it will compile fine. No, an error. Oh, excellent. So if there's a problem with the import, then you're going to get an error like this. And the bummer is that robot only spits out 1 error at a time. So hopefully there's a pattern to the errors. If you made one mistake, you're doing the same thing everywhere, and you can easily do a search and replace to fix it for all of them.
Right.
Otherwise, as you move through the errors, you'll have to deal with each thing. Okay, so it doesn't know what this underscore has specified input is. And it's looking, and so we know object properties needs to have all the object properties we might be using. So
You're looking at Mobio, Damien.
that's right. Thank you. Wondering why there weren't so many object properties. And so has input okay. And so what I've noticed is that it's quite possible, now that I'm using some different imports, that they've changed the label for what has specified input is. Now it used to have underscores and now it doesn't anymore. So that means I have to go take a look here. Okay. Oh, is specified output of and as specified input. Right. So it looks like there are 2 places where I have to have that updated to its new form.
So what would be the reason why somebody would change it from having an underscore to not?
I think this is an RO or an OB or an IAO change.
Okay.
It's quite possible that in some previous decade it was used this way, but somebody updated it. Okay, now we have to do the change over here too. The other one. Oops. And I'm doing this on all sheets quite confidently because there is only one sheet here, really.
Sure.
So otherwise, just limit it to this column to play it safe. Okay, so that means I have to update the sheet. So I copy everything. Go over to Wine TSV. Select all, replace, save. And then rerun. Oh, but the trick is this food on. Yeah, right. That's right. So the change I had to make, because the error was in the robot content itself, I had to make the change in that robot content. Sometimes you might be referring to a name that's existing in the main merged file, but the merged file has a name that's changed, one of the parent terms, in which case you have to go make the change back in wherever else in the ontology, recompile so that you get this update of the Foodon merged or the Mobio merged so that the name is correct there and updated, and then your robot won't generate any errors. Okay, so I ran it and it came back without any errors. So as a result, nothing changes in this folder, but go back up and you'll see Robot Wine has a date of today. Now, sometimes just changing that import file, if your ontology references it, will be enough to trigger Protégé to say, there's been a change in this import. Would you like to reload? And I would say yes. And then you will immediately perhaps see the changes in your content in Mobio. But if you don't see the changes immediately, that doesn't mean they didn't happen. It just means that Protégé might not have loaded it correctly. So occasionally you'll have to reload Protégé and to see the change. Okay, so that's the cycle for editing some import file that's been established. If you need to add a new import file, so say, for example, we just ran that process, but we hadn't incorporated this Robot Wine OFN file, then to mock up what the experience is, you hit this direct import here and import a local file, continue. You have to browse usually. And find out that you're needing to go into the source, into the ontology, into the imports folder, and one. Oh, right, I am in Mobio, right, imports folder, and you would see the import file to load in. So here I am looking at Mobio when I should be reattaching that thing to Foodon. So I'll go do the same thing in Foodon. Robot Wine. Open. A little bit later on, there's a little bit of a technical thing around how Protégé is set up to use this, what's called a catalog file for managing imports. Once we get some imports established, we should tweak the catalog file And I'll open it up here to show the food-on version of it. It's this pesky catalog file. And what it's trying to do is help Protege out in managing the location and the web identity of import files. But it can be a little confusing if you're changing the names of import files or adding or taking away import files over time. So just a technical note, I'll help look at and manage this in a first round. Basically, the catch is we have to program a little bit to make it stable, a little more stable over time. Otherwise, some confusing things can happen for users. But I won't say anything more about that right now. Okay, so I think the last piece is to look at what some of these commands are doing and see what this robot, we keep on saying we're going to use robot, but really we're using one command within robot. Robot actually has many other commands at its fingertips. So here's the robot.obolibrary.org file. And it's giving you a little bit of loading up information. It does come with ODK. So when you're using ODK, you've already got it loaded for your computer or Docker. And now it's helping out a little bit of info here, but we're using this template command. But there are many others. You can use robot in a query with a SPARQL query to query an ontology or more. You can merge ontologies. You can extract bits out from all using any one of these commands. Focusing on the template command, it's explaining what I just showed you in terms of an output file identity, the actual output. You can add that it's the stuff you're working on is aware of certain prefixes. Mobi are by default, but other prefixes if you're referring to other ontologies. And it's mentioning the 2 rows of content, the headers that you can call whatever you want, and then the template row that's got the commands in it. And big long spiel about all the different commands and the fact that you can use robot to create instance level information, not just classes. So you can actually use robot to create RDF graphs of data, not just the ontology T-box language, but also the A-box assertions used with the language. And I've done that to do this pesticide ontology where
Damien, I have a question.
Oh yeah.
So can you use the robot to construct a search thing for your ontology terms so that related terms come together when you search?
So robot will create a knowledge graph or a graph, an RDF, subject predicate object graph of whatever you want. Whether it doesn't have any Elasticsearch free text capability whatsoever. If you're querying your ontology, the only tool robot's providing you outright querying, getting inside what labels might have or numbers or ranges or structure in that graph, you're using SPARQL queries for that.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you're looking at like compiling an instance level database plus the ontology, then this paper on pesticide products is helpful, but much more so the robot tables that I put together for it, because it's not just creating classes of things, in this case classes that cover companies and their locations, or that reference Wikipedia locations, or chemistry of pesticides, active ingredients of pesticides. this example is showing instance level and class level robot activity. So if you guys get around, have any need for creating instance level stuff, that's a separate topic, but there's a kind of a paper and system that is a good reference for how to use robot for that. Right, so back to the robot commands. So just a crash course. A stands for annotation. So whatever's being listed in the content is going to be an annotation of some kind. L stands for language. And that means it's not just the RDFS annotation label, but it's going to add the language tag English on it. And so if you have textual labels for your terms, you could get in the habit of indicating that the language is English that they're being delivered to. And Obo Foundry is now making a big move to have it that by default people use language tags for their content. So here's a language annotation, and it's the definition one in English. SC stands for subclass, and here's the little % sign, and it means it's substituting whatever entity it can find by that name as the subclass. So this is being substituted. I think the % sign is this idea, and it's substituting as a subclass of grape abstract. And this split command is providing a mechanism so that you can have more than one parent class for this term. So you'll see a variety of these cells have this split, and it means that you can list more than one entity separated by the vertical sign. So when I scroll down, I will find, or scroll up, I should find a couple of classes that have more than one parent here. No? Okay, well, then it wasn't used in this column, this split. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Okay,
Well-
yeah, so you just have a bar in between the two.
That's right.
Okay.
And definition source, there it's showing a couple of different definition sources with the bar. Spaces don't matter, as I recall. A couple of synonyms. Okay, so it's that one. Subclass of, right, so this row is subclass of, and the % sign is this thing is being substituted in. There's a little bit of icky-picky stuff. So around quotes. So a number of these things that are only mentioning one term in the ontology, they don't need any quotes, single quotes around them. But as soon as you get into the business of creating axioms, robot is very particular. So here's a logical axiom, subclass of, and the % sign means whatever is here is going to be paired with what's in the row. But that content, it's a little more complicated. It has to have a leading quote, and then any multi-word term has to have quotes around it inside the expression. Now, it's okay if you have a single word with quotes around it, but the multi-term words with spaces in them have to have quotes. That's going to be a common error that shows up when you try to compile it. You have to futz with this.
Right, but that in the end essentially puts in the relationship like grape, what was it? Grape wine derives from grape
Right.
pulp.
Yeah, and we can see that in
There it is, under subclass of, Damien, derives from.
right, that's it. Yeah. And I was looking at the equivalency statement, which isn't actually included in the robot file. So here's here's a case where we're saying a lot of stuff that's in the robot file, and you'll see in the mouse over that it says which ontology it's from. I mean, which file.
Yeah.
Robot. And you'll see as well in gray, light gray, where each annotation is possibly from another file. So you can actually have an entity like Grapevine with stuff from different files. So this one is actually not in the robot file. This one's actually in another import file. So watch out for that sometimes. If you're trying to fix or change something, it may not actually be in one particular file.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick question, Damien?
Yeah.
I realize I got here late, so you may have already covered this, so please don't go over it again. If you did, I'll watch the recording later. But for most of this, are you doing it in the Protege or are you doing it in the robot file?
Robot file has been the subject of this tutorial. And so this particular thing, I'm just pointing out that you can actually weave content from other import files or the main, in this case, foodonEdit file, or Mobio edit. You can weave them all in to be talking about an entity with a certain ID. Yeah. So
I guess it just meant when you do it initially, do you do it in the Protege or do you do it in the robot file?
Yeah, we covered that in the tutorial earlier. Basically, it's a matter of where you want to find the ID for something, and certainly you can create something initially in the Protege file and just give it a name, or you can just grab hold of an ID, knowing that it's not being used by anybody, and start with the robot file in that.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, just one little note. If you are moving axioms around, of course, it doesn't make any sense to move an axiom or annotation from into a robot file in Protege. And it probably doesn't make sense to move it out of a robot file, but you are able to move terms from one import file to another by using that move to, right-click mouse, move to, or pull into active ontology. Those commands, occasionally I use those, especially for deprecating terms, to move them into separate files.
Damien, I also have a question. I'm assuming that if we start looking at it and we get stuck, we can get help from the GitHub link in terms of the documents that has been documented over there, or not everything is up there yet.
So GitHub itself doesn't really have any help info about this robot technology. You'd have to go to robot file here.
Okay.
To learn about the particular commands that this template command is giving. So this, I don't know what tech this is. James Overton and his group created this tool that's used within Mobile Foundry.
Okay.
Here's where that AL tag is being talked about. AI. It's got facility for tagging classes, tagging instances of classes, and you have to use different terminology for that. And then, so it's a little bit picky here and there, but if you need any help trying to figure some of this stuff out, I can help. But the template files that Ashura has set up and that I'm using here should cover most of the bases for the tags we need.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're at a place where we can get the template files set up, and once we actually go to do our first kind of like build of the ontology using those template files, I'm sure we'll encounter lots of errors, but every time we do that, I'm sure it will also improve, right? And it's sort of like like the hardest thing is always getting started, right? Because you feel like you want to have everything set up and ready to go from the get-go, but you're always going to encounter some kind of error. And especially with this type of tool, it might be time consuming to fix the errors, but it won't break anything in the meantime. Any kind of like public release, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
And just one last little tidbit. So here's this curation status field, IAO, blah, blah, blah. You'll see somebody put IDs for curation statuses in here, and these are all instances. Requires review, ready for release, etc. So I've just actually put the free text name in, and this works just as easily as this in this case. So anyway, that's the very last little tidbit. And I think that's it for the robot covering. Any other questions about this?
I don't have anything right now. I mean, that was great, Damien. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, I really appreciate it. So I think like what we can basically do. So what would you recommend, I guess? So there with the food on one, you had food on wine, and it was one sheet that had the wine terms, right? But in your pesticide ontology, the whole sheet was pesticide ontology, and you had multiple different tabs, right? So which do you think we should do? Because I can kind of imagine both, where we have like Mobio, let's say we have Mobio recombinases and Mobio transposons. We could have that as two separate sheets that are being modified independently, or we could have it as two tabs in a sheet.
Totally put it together. One sheet, two tabs or end tabs. There's no reason to keep them separate unless one team hated the other and didn't want to know anything about the other's work.
Right.
Permission wise, you can actually lock rows and parts of sheets from editing by different users, and that might show up later. Literally, Foodon, this whole sheet is totally visible to the public in view and comment mode. I think view mode anyway.
Yeah.
So that's we're operating at that level of public access. You guys might want to just keep it lock and key for the development cycle. But ultimately, in the open source world, you can point people to where all the terms are curated.
Right. And that's good. And I mean, that's good to know, because we can actually I imagine that we'll be referencing these food on tables a lot kind of as we build Mobio, just to say like a sanity check for what you're adding and how you're adding it, right? Even though they're completely different topics, but just like the general structure of it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Not all tabs on this are actually robot tables. There are a couple that are run by using other scripts.
Sure.
You can your whole Mobio table can be a mixture of different things.
Right. Because the key thing that robot looks for is those IDs, right? Like the SC and the AL.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And there's another aspect to the automation, which is there are some tools right now that command line can go fetch Google Sheet content. So I'm making that extra step of copying this manually to a a TSV on my local computer to modify that. But we could actually combine running a command level robot tool with going to fetch the latest version of that table online. That would be the deluxe version. I think James Overton has some tools around doing that.
Okay. Yeah, it all sounds great. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're past 2 o'clock here, so